As we get another day closer to free agency, there's still lots up in the air for the Carolina Hurricanes in determining what direction they will go in this offseason. Could they be looking for a second line center? Could they be looking for a top six winger? Could they be looking for both? There is a lot of question marks when it comes to what is next for the Hurricanes this offseason as they look to be aggressive. We talked about Pistachios from the Vancouver Canucks coming to the Carolina Hurricanes, but what about his teammate Brock Boeser?
You're Locked On Hurricanes, your daily podcast on the Carolina Hurricanes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to a Wednesday edition of Locked On Hurricanes, your team every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thank you to the Everydayer for making this your first listen of the day. 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, talking everything about Carolina Hurricanes. I'm your host, Zach Martin. I'm the credentialed Carolina Hurricanes beat writer over at the Hawkers, also the co-host of the Surgecast, which is a weekly Carolina Hurricanes podcast, along with all my duties here at Locked On Hurricanes. Got a fun Wednesday edition of the pod as we get to look at Brock Boeser to see, will he be a possible target for the Carolina Hurricanes this offseason as they look to be aggressive and load up for the 25-26 season. Does it make sense to bring him here? What could a possible contract look like with Boeser? Of course, big thanks to AFP Analytics for the roster projections and contract projections of that as well. And then finally, if the Hurricanes do manage to sign Boeser, where does he fit in the lineup? Well, to start off with, does it make sense to bring Brock Boeser to Carolina if you're the Hurricanes? And I would say it would make sense because we all know the Hurricanes definitely need some help on the top six. The depth is overall pretty good for the Hurricanes, but if you're looking for actual top six talent to alleviate the pressure off the first line to do a lot of the scoring, they're going to need to bring in a bona fide top six scorer, and that is definitely on the wings. Now, like I said, I did talk about three center options earlier this week, and one of them was Pistachios. The thing is, who says that we cannot just bring only one Canuck? What if we brought two Canucks? And the guy I'm thinking about is Brock Boeser. Now, there's a lot of up in the air right now about Mitch Marner. There's been a lot of talks of maybe Vegas, LA Kings, the Anaheim Ducks are actively being sought as one of the guys to go over $14 million to bring Marner to Southern California. So let's say Marner doesn't work out for the Hurricanes. He goes out west, so be it. Who is that next possible guy on the wing the Hurricanes could bring in for the top six? And for me, you could look at Nikolai Ehlers and obviously Brock Boeser. Where for me, it would make sense because you look at a guy who, as of right now, with the Canucks, at the end of last season, did play second line with Max Sexton and Jake DeBrusk. Did see some first line minutes as well with Höglander, Suter at one point, even Elias Pettersson when he was playing. So Boeser definitely has a lot of top six minutes with the Canucks. Right winger, right shot, 28 years old. He had 25 goals in 50 points in 75 games last year with the Canucks. Average ice time during even strength was just a tad under 14 minutes. Only 16 penalty minutes, and his points per game was a .67. So the good thing is he doesn't really take a lot of penalties. And yes, you're looking at a 20 to 25 goal scorer where, looking back 2 seasons ago for 23-24, he had a 73-point season. First time he ever hit 70, he had 40 goals that year. This past season, I guess you would consider it as a down year, but overall, though, still pretty good for a guy that had over 1,000 minutes of ice time and was still able to put 25 goals in the net in 75 games, which would put him in the top 3 for the Carolina Hurricanes. So you add him in. You can put him first line. You can put him on the first line with Aho and Svetch or Aho and Jarvis, however you want to do it. Or if you think that, hey, you've played second line minutes, we really like Jarvis up here on the first line with Aho and Svetch, or however that works out. They could also put Boeser on that second line opposite of Taylor Hall, and then you figure out who your second line center is. Let's say it is Pius Suter that they bring in as well. You bring in both guys. Now, and that's a familiar teammate. He's played with them the last couple of years. There's some good chemistry right there that could work out. So let's say you do get Pius Suter and Brock Boeser, and you throw them on your second line with Taylor Hall. Hey, that's not a bad top six when you're looking at those three as your second line. And then you got Svechnikov, Aho, Jarvis. That's a really solid top six, all things considered. But let's say they don't bring in Suter and they just bring in Boeser from Vancouver in free agency. Whoever they have at second line center, they're going to figure that out as well. And who says you can't have, this offseason where you go get your second line center of the future and you get Boeser? Either way, that's still a really good option. And for Carolina, it makes sense because you add a guy whose AAV was only $6.5 million with the Canucks as of late over the last three seasons. It was $19.95 million. Like I said, $6.65 million per year, and he's going to be an unrestricted free agent. So you have a good spot if you're the Hurricanes to go get a guy who's going to be 28. He's an unrestricted free agent. We'll talk more about what the contract will look like in segment 2, but you're bringing in a guy who's had some really good seasons as of late. Over 50 points the last 3 years. 50 this past year, 73 and 23-24, like I said, 55 points in 22-23. Every single season, he's pretty much over 45 points. And you look at a guy, too, who outside of maybe, 22-23 and 19-20, every year he's over 20 goals. So you're automatically going to get over a 20-goal scorer year in, year out, a 50-point guy year in and year out. So you can't go wrong with adding a guy like that. And the fact, too, his contract, his AAV isn't going to be astronomical. It's not going to be a 10, 11, $12 million. You could still work a deal out to bring him to Carolina. Then you could still go get your second line center like you want. You go get a defenseman if you want as well, and you can still build around this team and still set you up for the 2026 offseason, where the cap is projected to go up to $104 million next summer. So even depending on how you sign Boeser this year, you're still looking at at $8.5 million going up in cap space for the following summer. So however you want to work this out, you can still be able to take care of your RFAs next season as well, and still bring in the guys that you want for this upcoming 25 summer of adding that second line center, adding that top six, that defenseman in your defensive core, adding that winger that you really like. So adding something like Boeser would make sense because, like I say, he's only 28. He fits in the same age range as Aho, Slavin. He's not that much older than the other guys too, of Jarvis and Svechnikov and all of them. You're going to have Boeser who's 28. You give him a 5 or 6 year deal that's only putting him at 34, 33, 34 when that contract's up, and that's still fitting within one of a lot of the guys that you have right now. It doesn't have to be a super long 8-year deal or 7 years because he's not really with the team. So you don't really have to go up to $7 million if you get Boeser. So he still fits in that current window of all the guys you have now. And like I said, you're not having to break the bank to go get him. Like I said, he's got top 6 minutes. He's been scoring pretty much over 20 goals every season in his career outside of maybe a couple of years. But he's going to give you those points that you really need. He's going to give you those goals. And like I said, too, he gives you the flexibility to build around him and the roster where you could add more guys in and you feel good about it. And that's even with the cap going up to $95 million and with it going up to, 104 next summer. That's really setting you up for this upcoming 25 offseason and the 2026 offseason when the cap goes back up again. Because like I said, it's 95.5 now. Then it's going to go up to 104. So if you don't go get Marner, if it doesn't really work out, you don't bring him in. You have the option of Ehlers and Boeser. Of course, we'll talk about Ehlers on another episode. This is mainly about Brock Boeser. But that's still not a bad option for the Carolina Hurricanes, where, like I said, he made $6.65 million the last 3 seasons with the Canucks. His projection is still relatively good to where you can still go get him if you want and other guys in free agency as well. That being said, what would a projected contract for Brock Boeser look like? Well, stick around and I'll talk about that here in a second on a Wednesday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with wonderful pistachios. Wonderful pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. They're the satisfying crack of opening each shell. It's like a snack meditation. And whether you're running between meetings or dropping it off the kids, wonderful pistachios are the snack that works just as hard as you do. So get snacking and get cracking with a snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Welcome back to segment 2 of Locked On Hurricanes, your team every day. So we kind of talk about why it would make sense to bring Brock Boeser to Carolina, talk about, the AAV that he had with the Canucks where he, played with them for the most part, his points and all that. So being said, what could a contract look like if the Carolina Hurricanes went to go after Brock Boeser? Well, like I said, the last 3 years, he had a $19.95 million deal, came out to $6.65 million over the last 3. Now, AFP Analytics, those guys are great. I'm always going to shout these guys out for what they've done. They are projecting for Boeser to get a 6-year deal at $50.756 million, which does come out to $8.459 million for the cap hit, and then the projected cap hit percentage of how much it would take up the cap space out of the 95.5, it would only take up 8.86. So if you're the Carolina Hurricanes, you're still paying him less than Sebastian Aho. It's only a 6-year deal, which would put him at around, 35 at the time, 34, 35. So you're still giving yourself a good opportunity to give him that long-term deal that he wants of those 6 years, and it's at 8.459 per season, which isn't really bad at all if you think about it for a guy who gets you over 20 goals a season, who's relatively within the 50-point range to 60-point range. Has only hit over 60 once, but you're still getting a 50-point guy who's scoring over 20 goals a season. And like I said, less than 8.5. That's really good. You could even go up to 8.5 if you really wanted to. So let's say if it is an $8.5 million for 6 years. That's really good for the Carolina Hurricanes because, like I said, when we talked about possibly bringing Pistachios in as well, that's still a really good deal on that side of things as well, to where you could go get both guys. Pistachios per AFP Analytics, 4 years, $19.9 million, and that only comes out to 4.983, 5.22% of the cap. So let's say that you go up to 5 on Suter. That's still really good. Then let's say you go up to where you're looking at Boeser, who's projected at that 8 range. That's still a guy you go get in Brock Boeser who's making 8.4. Let's say you go get 8.5. You're talking 8.5 and 5. That's still $13.5 million for 2 guys that you bring in that you can add to your top 6. And you still have a lot of cap space left open up too, to where you're not having to go and pay. Let's say you don't go get Marner for that $10, $11 million. But you go get these 2 guys, you combine them for the 5 and the 8.5. $13.5 million is still pretty good, all things considered, where now you've got your, you just added to your top 6 and Boeser and Suter. And that's what, if you don't get Marner, that's why I think Boeser is a good option to have here for the Carolina Hurricanes, where, maybe you don't get the bigger fish. You're still getting a guy who is a tier below him, but still in the tier that still makes your top 6 a lot better, and it gives you the relief of not having to rely on your top line to do all the scoring. Because there were some times during the season in 24-25 where the Hurricanes wished they had more scoring, just outside of the big guys. Or even when the, Aho and Svechnikov and those guys kind of struggled a little bit. They kind of wish they had some guys out in the top 6 as well, outside of them, to produce. Jarvis was, Taylor Hall when it came later on. Jackson Blake finished with 17 goals this season, but adding a guy like Boeser would definitely help out in that case too, and even in the playoffs. Because while the Canucks did miss the playoffs this past year, Brock Boeser still did pretty well in the playoffs with the Canucks. He had 7 goals, 12 points in 12 games. The last time they were in the playoffs, back in 1920, in 17 games, he still had 4 goals and 11 points. He's only seen the playoffs twice in his career with the Canucks, and if you're looking at a guy who's played over 50, 60 games since 17, 18, he's only seen the playoffs twice in his entire career. Coming to Carolina would be such a huge boost for him. But if you think about it, in 29 playoff games, 11 goals, 12 points or 12 assists for 23 points. 23 points in 29 games is pretty good for a guy who's only seen the postseason twice. And that's what I'm saying. You can go give Boeser that 8.5, and you still feel pretty good about yourself for the fact you just locked this guy up for 6 seasons. And you still go get other guys to fit around him. Like I said, you could go get Pius Suter for 4 years at $5 million if you really want to, AAV-wise. And that would still give you plenty of cap to go get other players as well, because the Hurricanes are going to be at 28.4. You take 13.5 off of that, you're still getting relatively around, like, what, $12 million to play with? That still gives you a great opportunity to go get something. Go get that other defenseman that you really want if you don't think Scott Moore is ready to go yet. If you already think Nikishin's going to be ready to go for next season, let's say you go get that extra defenseman you really wanted. Maybe you go and bring back Eric Robinson as a 13th forward if you really want to as well. Maybe you go get that third goalie. Maybe it's an Alex Lyon or whoever else you want to bring in as a backup in case, not going to want Frederick Anderson. Hopefully doesn't get hurt, but if you need to go get a third goalie that has experience of playing in the NHL, you can still get that too. And you're still setting yourself up for the 2026 offseason where the cap does go up to $104 million. You've got your RFAs you need to take care of. You got your other potential future UFAs that could be either getting their contracts done next offseason or the offseason after that in 27. And there's a lot of guys that are going to be free agents next year. But being able to have that cap space this summer to go still load up and still set yourself up for the future is really good. And I think, like I said, if Marner doesn't work out, like I said, if you go somewhere else, hey, you tried, some team was able to throw him $14, $15 million. Maybe the Hurricanes didn't really want to go up that high. You still have a good option in Ehlers. Like I said, we'll talk about him in another show. But Boeser wouldn't be a bad option either. Boeser could still get you under $9 million for a winger for 6 seasons who's played a lot of top 6 minutes, has shown what he could do in the playoffs if the team makes it to the playoffs. And you put him on a contending team like Carolina who makes it every year, I bet you his playoff numbers are going to skyrocket, especially with a team like this. His two-way style fits well. He can score. This is a guy who really could thrive in a system like Rod Brind'Amour. I talked about Suter, how he got a lot better under Rick Tocchet. That next level is Rod Brind'Amour, and I think that could be the same thing for Boeser. If you give Boeser that continual, stability of a head coach, because they've went through Boudreau, they've went through Tocchet, the Canucks went through a lot of coaches recently and different systems. But if you put him in Carolina with Rod, who has been there for the last 7 seasons, who's got another 4 years on his current contract, he'll be basically the head coach until he's decided he wants to retire at this point. Giving him the stability of a head coach like Rod Brind'Amour, I think that will take Boeser's game to the next level. So I think if you're looking at a contract that could work, I think this deal for the Hurricanes, looking at 6 years it's projected 8.45. I would say even 8.5. If you want to shoot it to 9, just to give him that a little extra money, that still works too. I still think that works out perfectly because then you're looking at 9 for him, let's say 5 for Suter. Now you got $14 million locked up with 2 guys who you're bringing into your top 6. But if it's Boeser, $8.5 to $9 million for 6 years, you cannot be upset about that. And like I said, where would he fit in the lineup? Now, I did kind of talk about top six, but where specifically would he be in the top six? Where else could he be in the lineup? So stick around and we'll talk about it here in a second on a Wednesday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Welcome back to segment 3 of Locked On Hurricanes, your team every day. Now, like I said, we talked about why would it make sense to bring Brock Boeser to Carolina? What kind of contract would it look like, if they did offer him one? Now, where would he fit in the lineup for the Carolina Hurricanes? Now, like I said, he played top 6 minutes with the Canucks, saw first line, saw second line, bunch of different guys that he played with. In Carolina, they could technically put him in the first line if they really wanted to. Could it be with Aho and Jarvis or Aho and Svech? That's a good possibility. If they like Jarvis up there with those guys, then they can still put Boeser on the second line because he's played second line minutes. You put him with maybe a Taylor Hall on the left. If they bring in his teammate Pius Suter, that works out perfectly. If not, they'll find another second line center because they'll definitely have a lot of cap space open up to go get that second line center. So you could put Boeser with Hall on his wing and then whoever is manning the middle. Or like I said, you could put him in that top line and you kind of figure out line combos from there of his left wing, and then you're going to have Aho. Not bad, all things considered, where you can put Boeser either first or second line, because at least it gives you're alleviating the pressure off of one of those lines to where they're not having to be the guy stepping up game in and game out. You have that extra top 6 talent and top 6 depth to help this team take it to the next level. Now, looking past that, where else could he possibly play? Well, he did play first power play minutes with the Canucks. That was with DeBrusk, Suter, Garland, and Quinn Hughes. Not bad, all things considering. You have Brock Boeser up there as one of your forwards, with guys, like I said, that he's kind of with, and of course, the captain, Quinn Hughes. And that's what I'm saying. If you bring Suter and Boeser, that's not bad. So he could look at first power play minutes with the Hurricanes if they really think that could be it. Then, in that case, you can move Blake down to the second power play unit. Then the first unit, it's going to have Aho, Jarvis, Svechnikov, Boeser, Gostisbehere. Great first power play unit, all things considered. You cannot be upset with that when you have essentially your first line, your second line winger and Boeser, and then you're going to have Shane Gostisbehere as your first power play quarterback. There you go. Now, past that, will he be on the penalty kill? Most likely not. He doesn't really give that option of a PK guy like a Suter could. That's why adding him would be great too. But Boeser really wouldn't be a guy you would throw on the penalty kill unit. It would still be Aho, Jarvis, and then probably Stahl, be Stahl and Martinook, Jankowski and Carey, however you want to play that out. So you really don't have to play Boeser on your penalty kill. But you still give him that possibility of being a guy that you throw on the first power play unit, guy you can put on your top 6, depending on what line, if you want to do first or second line. Obviously, 4-on-4, he's going to be either on the first unit or the second unit. If you go to overtime, could be a guy that you could really see on one of those 3-on-3 lines, shootout, all that good stuff. So there's really a lot of ways you can add Boeser to the lineup where, you're not having to use him for every situation like some other guys, guys like Aho and Jarvis who can play, on the PK, on the power play, on wherever line they want to on the top, on the even strength. Boeser could be one of those guys where it's, hey, we're just going to keep you for power play and your 5-on-5 play. And, of course, every other, if you're talking overtime, shootouts and all that. So it's still not a bad option, all things considered, when you bring in a guy like Boeser, where you don't have to use him. Not every guy has to be in every single situation. You can save guys for where their strengths are, because that's what's so great about the depth of the Hurricanes and just having guys that you can kind of maneuver around to make it work for you and play it to their strengths. So that's where I would think most likely Boeser would be. First or second line, first power play unit. Those are probably the big key factors for the Carolina Hurricanes. And like I said, you're looking at a guy that you could give a contract to within the $8.5 to $9 million range. It's still less than Aho. It's only 6 years. If you want to give him the 7, that's fine too. That's still not bad. Because you're still talking a guy who's going to be going up to 30, 33, 34 with a 6-year deal. If you want to give him that 7 to take him to 35, you still could do that too. either way, that's not really a bad option, all things considered. We look at a guy like Boeser, who year in and year out scores you 20 goals a season, gets you to that 25 range. He's had hit 30 once, but you know he can get there. You know he's going to get you 50 points every season. That's great to have. He's had some playoff success, even though he's only seen the playoffs twice, but 23 points in 29 games is still nothing to scoff at for a guy who's only seen the postseason twice. But if you give him that extra stability, like I said, with having Rod Brind'Amour there every single season, not having to go through Bruce Boudreau, Rick Tocchet, insert other 3 coaches they've had here, you give him a guy like Brind'Amour who's been there for the last 7 seasons, who's got another 4 years left on his contract. You know he's not going to go anywhere in Carolina. You know that Rod could take him to the next level. And I think that's where it could be really great to have a guy like Boeser who come in, who's has been able to do what he's done under circumstances of going through different systems, different head coaches, almost every other year, every 2 years. But you bring him to Carolina where nothing really changes. The team's always getting better every year. They're always making the playoffs. They're always winning at least the first round. If you give him just multiple years of consecutive playoff appearances, I think you'll see those numbers definitely go up, trend in the right direction. His confidence will start shooting up too. And you're putting him on a really close-knit team where they will definitely find a way to make him, fit in well with this group, because that's just what the culture is in Carolina. And it puts him in a spot where he's just going to be with a contender every year. And I think it would be a great spot to have Boeser. Like I said, if it doesn't work out for the bigger fish in Marner, I guess you could go get Boeser, and that's a really great option to have, to be able to still get him, whatever the contract is, and still go get other guys that you can add to the lineup that fit in your top 6, fit on your defense if you want to add a 6th defenseman, even add a depth defenseman, even add a 13th forward, a third goalie for some insurance. That's the great thing about adding Boeser is that, maybe you're not paying that Marner $13 to $14 million deal, but you're paying Boeser, $8.5 to $9. That still puts you in a good spot where the cap's at 95.5 this season. You can still go get the rest of the guys you want for your lineup. And then you're looking at the cap going up in 26 at the summer of 26, where it goes up to 104 possibly. Then you're really saying to yourself, because that contract's going to look great with the cap going up, basically $8.5 million. And then you have your RFAs to care about next year. Give some possible extensions to guys that are going to have a year left on their contracts, what have you. But now you have one of your top 6 wingers in Boeser locked up for at least 6 or 7 years. That's still putting you in a great spot then, where you don't have to worry about that. If you add him in your second line center this summer, your top 6 is locked in for 25, 26, and 26, 27 at the earliest, and even past that. Depending on what they do with Taylor Hall with his 3-year deal, but you're at least looking at the next 3 seasons at the minimum with Boeser in your top 6, whoever you bring in as your second line center, Hall on your left side, and you're even talking about Svech, Aho, and Jarvis on your top line. Your top 6 is looking fantastic, and that can really give you some great, talent on the depth of that area, to where one line's not having to do everything. Now you have a top 6 where you can run those 2 lines. And then, of course, the third line with possibly Stankoven and the Jordans. Now you're rolling 3 lines. You look at the fourth, Carrier, Jankowski, and Blake. Now you're looking at running 4 lines. So there's a lot of great possibilities. And I think Boeser could be a great option to have if the Hurricanes do make a run for him instead. So it'll be interesting to see what the Hurricanes do. They got $28.4 million in cap, but hey, $8.5 or $9 million for Brock Boeser, throwing him on your top 6, first power play in it. Can't go wrong with that, especially with the cap space you have this summer and next summer as well. So we'll see what happens come July 1st with the Carolina Hurricanes and all the money they have in their cap space. But, guys, this will be a Wednesday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Thank you for making your first listen today. If you're a second listen, go to check out Locked On NHL Game Night. Every game, every night until the Stanley Cup champion is crowned. Get local analysis on a national scale. Find NHL Game Night on Locked On NHL on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to keep up with me, I'm at OneTrueZach on X. The podcast is LO_Hurricanes. I'm also on Blue Sky, the Zachary Martin, where you can check out all of my articles at thehockeywriters.com. If you want to check out my other podcasts, well, it's the Searchcast on all podcast platforms and on YouTube. For this show, well, you can check Locked On Hurricanes on Spotify, Google, Apple, iHeartRadio, wherever you listen to your podcast. Follow, subscribe, leave a 5-star rating and review because I might just read it on the show. For YouTube, it's Locked On Hurricanes. Subscribe. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss a show. Hit the thumbs up. Tell me know if you like the show as well. Share it with all other Caniacs to become everydayers just like you. But hope everyone enjoyed the Wednesday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Enjoy your Wednesday. And until next time, as always, let's go Canes.